Have you ever fallen victim to a scam so intricate, so perfectly executed, that you didn't realize until it was too late? This is the story of Benny Lowy, a man who preyed on the vulnerable, exploited people's trust, and left a trail of shattered hopes and lost money in his wake. My wife and I thought we were helping someone in need, but we were just the latest targets in his long history of scams. He was in his late 50s, had suffered a near-fatal cardiac event, and had spent a long time in recovery. After surviving such a close call with death, he was overwhelmed with gratitude for the care he'd received, particularly from my wife. Benny, her patient, had offered us an incredible deal. He was selling an LCD TV, one of those sleek, state-of-the-art models that were just starting to gain popularity. The thought of getting a brand new LCD for such a low price was too tempting. So, without hesitation, we agreed to Benny's offer. My wife paid him, and he promised to get the TV to us soon. It had only been used once as a demo unit, and he was offering it to us for a fraction of the retail price. What could possibly go wrong? At the time, I didn't question it. I was so caught up in the hope that things were finally turning around for us that I didn't see the warning signs. The catch? He wanted us to keep it quiet because doing this would jeopardize his relationship with the brand. But for that kind of discount, keeping it on the down low didn't seem like a big deal. Benny was a man who had experienced firsthand how fragile life could be, and he wanted to express his thanks in a meaningful way. Benny seemed like an honest man. He was a survivor, after all, having narrowly escaped death after his heart surgery. He had survived one of life's biggest scares and wanted to show his appreciation for the care my wife had given him. Plus, he had solid connections in the electronics import business, which gave him access to deals most people could only dream of. The position was for a mid-level role, and he made it sound perfect, exactly what I was looking for. The more he spoke, the more convinced I became. Here was a guy who had access to high-level positions and was offering me a chance at a fresh start. He promised a great salary, a solid career path, and best of all, he would personally help me prepare for the interview. Benny's father was a respected businessman in the community, and his brother was a doctor, someone my wife was familiar with through mutual acquaintances. These ties, especially the connection to a respected family, made him appear even more trustworthy. He wasn't just a patient to her. He was someone deeply moved by the life-saving treatment he received. It took years for the truth to come out, and even now, Benny's actions continue to haunt us. Here's how it all unfolded. Around the same time, as my work situation continued to worsen, my wife asked him if he knew of any job openings for me. I had just been laid off, and the uncertainty of unemployment weighed heavily on me. Benny seemed eager to help and assured her that he could find me something great. He was well connected, after all, and promised that he could pull a few strings for me. In the early 2000s, my wife worked as a nurse in the ICU of a well-regarded, high-end hospital. She had a demanding job, taking care of patients who had undergone major cardiac surgery, and her compassion and skill earned her the trust of many. At the same time, I was employed by a small company that was struggling. His appreciation was genuine, and he wanted to give back. He had mentioned to her that he worked in the electronic import business, and this caught my attention. It wasn't long before he offered us a deal that seemed too good to be true, which, spoiler alert, was exactly what it turned out to be. But at the time, with everything else going wrong in our lives, I saw this as a small glimmer of hope. What could possibly go wrong? The owners, nearing retirement, had made it clear that the business wasn't going to survive much longer. We hadn't secured any major contracts for a while, and layoffs were on the horizon. It was a stressful period, full of uncertainty. Amid all this, my wife came home one day to tell me about a patient she'd been caring for, Benny Lowy. Given my wife's deep empathy and the bond she'd built with him over his recovery, Benny seemed like someone trustworthy. One day, out of the blue, my wife called me practically buzzing with excitement. At the time, I wasn't thinking about potential risks. We had an old TV in the house. It had been a wedding gift, a heavy, outdated model that was difficult to move around, and we were eager for an upgrade. But that wasn't the end of Benny's generosity. Soon, Benny told my wife that he could set up an interview for me at a mining company. It all seemed so perfect. Benny had the right connections, could help us both in different ways, and seemed like an honest, generous man. The first red flag came when Benny didn't show up for the interview he had promised me. I had been preparing for this meeting for days, picking out my best suit, rehearsing my answers, and mentally preparing myself to take this step forward in my career. Benny had set everything up. He was supposed to be my guide, my mentor even, helping me navigate the interview at this promising mining company. But as the hours dragged on, I was left standing alone in the front yard of my house, looking at my watch, wondering what had gone wrong. This time, he told me his car had been stolen, and on top of that, his wallet had been left at the scene of the crime. My hope and desperation for a job had clouded my judgment. Each excuse felt more elaborate than the last, and part of me was still convinced that something out of his control was going wrong. He had appeared so trustworthy at first. He had connections, he had a plan, and he seemed like the kind of person who would keep his word. But after weeks of waiting, I found myself feeling helpless and frustrated. I wanted to believe him. I kept telling myself that something had to have happened outside of his control. Yet, despite the growing frustration, I was still clinging to the hope that I would get that interview, that I would get the TV, that I would finally get what had been promised. For weeks, Benny had been promising me a job, a great opportunity that was just around the corner. But something was nagging at me in the back of my mind. I decided to dig a little deeper, thinking that maybe I had missed something. Maybe I had been too trusting, too eager to believe in his good intentions. By this point, the promises had become part of my routine. I had been strung along for so long that I couldn't stop myself from hoping, just one more time, that this would finally be the opportunity I had been waiting for. And Benny, always with his smooth talk, knew exactly how to keep me hooked. Every time he made a promise, it was followed by an excuse, a delay, or a new story. I had put my faith in him, and I had begun to believe that he was the key to turning things around. I couldn't. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. I had given him the benefit of the doubt for far too long. I realized that I wasn't just frustrated by the delays and the broken promises. I was angry at myself for allowing this to continue. I had let my desperation cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I had allowed Benny to manipulate me. But now I could see the truth. I had already started to see the cracks in his story, the lies he had woven, and the chaos he had caused in my life. The mining company didn't exist. The job offer was a scam. And the TV, the phone, and everything else just another part of his game. I had been taken in by his charm and his stories, but now the truth was inescapable. I had been duped, and the worst part was, I had let it go on for far too long. But it was too late to undo what had been done. I was stuck in this mess, and all I had left were promises that were never going to be kept. It wasn't a career opportunity he was offering. It was a carefully crafted web of lies designed to keep me hooked, to keep me waiting, and to keep me from seeking other real opportunities. I started to realize that Benny wasn't just a man with bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. He was a master manipulator, someone who was playing me and countless others like pawns in his game. The job offer, the TV deal, the phone purchase, none of it was real. He was preying on my vulnerability, on my need for a stable job and a better future. And it worked. So I did what I should have done from the start. I Googled him. This time, he told me that the mining company had fired him. According to him, they had decided to go in a different direction, and as a result, he was out of a job. But rather than simply leaving it at that, Benny presented a new twist in his ever-evolving story. He had an even better opportunity for me. "I know this sounds crazy," he said, "but I've got a position for you. IT manager at a much bigger company. The salary? It's double what you were being paid before." Little did I know that the worst was yet to come. He painted a picture of a bright future for me. More money, a better position, and the chance to work for a reputable company. All I had to do was wait a little longer. He promised me an interview. He promised me the job. And he promised me that this time, everything would work out. Maybe he was just going through a tough time, and once things settled down, he'd make good on his promises. After all, he was a man of his word, or so I had thought. I would put on my best suit, ready for the interview, only to be left standing outside, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. But as the days passed, more and more promises were made, and yet nothing came through. My wife had already paid for the LCD TV. Benny had offered us another promise that remained unfulfilled. But the results were shocking. There was nothing. No social media profiles, no online presence, not a single mention of his so-called mining company. The company he had talked about with so much enthusiasm didn't even appear in search results. It was as if it didn't exist. I checked again, double-checked his name with variations, tried different keywords, but the silence was deafening. This was the first real clue that something was terribly wrong. If Benny had been who he claimed to be, there would have been some trace of him online, especially since he had told me he was a key figure in the mining industry. She had also bought the phone from him, a high-end Sony Ericsson, which was meant to be a gift for me. At this point, I felt like I was sinking deeper into a rabbit hole. There was no mining company, no job offer, no legitimate career opportunity. Benny had built an entire narrative around this phantom company, and I had bought into it completely. I realized, with growing dread, that I had been duped. My trust in him, in his connections, in his promises, it had all been a lie. But like the TV, the phone was never delivered. "It's a disaster," he said, "but I promise you, we'll reschedule." Each time Benny called, I'd feel a little bit more frustrated, a little bit more disillusioned. The promises were always there, wrapped in the guise of soon, just a little more time, and I'll make it right. But there was always an excuse. Every time I reached out to him, the story changed. First, it was the robbery, then the car theft, then the lost wallet. There was always some new complication, some new reason why nothing was happening. The frustration was palpable in his voice, but his tone was also strangely apologetic, almost like he was trying to make it all sound like it was no big deal. He reassured me once again that he'd make it up to me. Benny wasn't just letting me down professionally, he was now affecting my personal life as well. My wife's excitement about the deals had quickly turned to frustration as we watched our money disappear without any tangible results. The TV, the phone, and the job opportunity all were slipping further away with each passing day. But as he spoke, I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Was this really just bad luck, or was I being strung along? I called him multiple times, growing more frustrated with each unanswered ring. Finally, Benny picked up and explained that he had been assaulted and robbed. His voice was filled with distress as he told me that he couldn't make it to the interview anymore. He had been left beaten and in shock. His situation had become urgent, and he needed to deal with things immediately. The interview was postponed, but Benny promised he would make it up to me soon. His words were filled with reassurance. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll take care of everything. This is just a bump in the road." But for the first time, I started to feel a gnawing sense of doubt. Why couldn't he have called sooner to let me know? Why did I have to wait for hours, only to hear this? Days passed, and Benny rescheduled the interview for December 31st, right before New Year's. It seemed like a fresh start after all. I had to give him the benefit of the doubt, right? I thought the delay was just a bad situation, but he'd surely be on time this time. However, when December 31st arrived, I found myself in the same position again, waiting for Benny to show up. Hours passed, and once again I stood outside, dressed in my best suit, as the time ticked by. The interview was supposed to happen early in the day, but as noon approached and then passed, I began to worry. What was going on? When I finally managed to reach him, Benny's story had changed again. By now, I had begun to question Benny's credibility, but I still couldn't let go. I wanted to believe him. As the delays continued to mount, I began to feel like I was stuck in an endless loop of disappointment. I started to lose my patience, but deep down, I still held on to a sliver of hope that Benny would come through. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of betrayal grew stronger, but I couldn't bring myself to cut ties completely. It wasn't until the weeks dragged on and the excuses became more convoluted that I finally started to admit to myself that Benny wasn't the man he claimed to be. The more I thought about it, the more something didn't add up. I searched for Benny Lowy's name, his supposed mining company, and any trace of him in the business world. I also searched for any business dealings tied to Benny or his company. Nothing. Not a single record. But even then, I couldn't quite let go. A few days later, Benny called again. This sounded too good to be true, but Benny was so convincing, so sure of himself, that for a moment I actually believed him. But by then, my gut was screaming at me that I was being strung along. The pattern was clear. I had spent weeks convinced that Benny was my way out of a bad situation. The next time Benny called, I didn't answer right away. When I finally spoke to him again, I was no longer the eager job seeker I had been before. The truth was clear now. Benny wasn't who he claimed to be. It was my wife's keen ear that ultimately led to the breakthrough. After weeks of frustration and unanswered questions, she overheard a conversation at work that would change everything. He had already pieced together a disturbing pattern of deception. This wasn't the first time Benny had scammed someone. There was a mix of relief and disbelief in his voice. He admitted to the scams, though he tried to justify his actions by claiming he was suffering from mild dementia. Benny had been caught red-handed, and it was time to put an end to his scams once and for all. The funds were real, but the restitution felt hollow. The money couldn't bring back the time we had wasted, the hope that had been dashed, or the trust that had been broken. It wasn't the closure I had imagined, but it was the only one available. Sure, we got our money back, but the damage Benny had done was deeper than just financial. The emotional toll was something that couldn't be fixed with a check. A deal was struck. Benny would return the money he owed to his victims, but in exchange, we agreed not to pursue any further legal action. It wasn't the justice I had hoped for, but it was something. Benny's father and his brother, who had distanced themselves from him for years, were forced to lend him the money to pay us back. As difficult as it was to accept, they were the only ones left who could help him avoid the consequences of his actions. It was a pathetic excuse, and I could tell the detective wasn't buying it either. There was no sign of mental decline in Benny's behavior. He had been calculating, manipulative, and entirely in control of his actions. And deceived by someone who seemed so trustworthy, who had weaved such a convincing web of lies, still lingered. The hope Benny had given us was shattered, and I couldn't simply move on from the weeks of uncertainty and disappointment. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the feeling of being duped by someone who had preyed on our vulnerability at a time when we needed help the most. But as far as Benny was concerned, this excuse was his way of trying to avoid the full weight of responsibility. "We've got him," he said, almost sounding surprised himself. He admitted to everything. It was a small victory, but one we had been waiting for, perhaps unknowingly, for weeks. In fact, it turned out Benny had a long history of preying on people at their most vulnerable moments, unemployed individuals, people in desperate need of career advancement, and those struggling financially. It was heartbreaking to realize we weren't the only ones Benny had duped. There were other victims, just like us, whose hopes had been crushed by this man. One of her coworkers, who also worked part-time at another hospital, was discussing Benny Lowy in a hushed tone. To my surprise, this nurse had fallen victim to the same scam. But what hit us harder was the detail her coworker revealed. Benny wasn't just some isolated case. He had targeted her as well, offering a similar deal that turned out to be just as fraudulent. Her coworker's husband, a local detective, had been investigating Benny for a while. The detective wasted no time in digging deeper into Benny's past. As he pieced together more information, it became clear that Benny had been running this con for years. He would identify people going through tough times and offer them a seemingly golden opportunity, just like he had with me. The job offers, the deals on electronics, the promises, each one was carefully crafted to exploit his victim's trust and desperation. And with each failed promise, Benny moved on to the next person, leaving behind a trail of broken dreams and lost money. I'll never forget the moment the detective called me to inform me that Benny had been detained. When Benny was finally confronted, he didn't put up much of a fight. The detective, however, wasn't interested in making this a long, drawn-out legal battle. That night, Benny's payment-arrived money borrowed from his family to settle the debt he owed us. Even though we were paid back, the feeling of being manipulated, the satisfaction of knowing Benny had been caught, didn't fully erase the bitterness of the experience. But it was a step toward closure. After everything we had gone through, I couldn't just walk away and move on. I knew there were more victims out there, more people like me who had been taken in by Benny's lies and manipulations. I couldn't let him keep getting away with it. So I decided to create a blog. It wasn't a huge idea at first, just a simple platform where I could share my story. The blog began with a single post detailing my experience with Benny. It became a public record of Benny's scams, proof that he had been operating for years, taking advantage of people in vulnerable positions. A few years after the blog started gaining traction, he tried to silence me. He hired a lawyer and attempted to sue me, claiming that I was undermining his activity and damaging his reputation. It was laughable. He had already ruined his own reputation, and his actions spoke louder than any legal threats. It wasn't just a blog anymore. It was a space for truth. It was a place for people to take back some of the power Benny had stolen from them. And it was a permanent record of his deceit, one that would continue to haunt him for years to come. But I wasn't intimidated. I knew I had done nothing wrong, and so did the stories. The voices of his victims continued to echo through the comments and posts. No matter how much he tried to bury the truth, it was out there now forever. The blog wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure that Benny Lowy's name would forever be linked to his lies and manipulations. And if it helped even one person avoid falling into his trap, then it was all worth it. The truth was on my side, and I wasn't going to back down. Each new post painted a clearer picture of the man behind the lies. He wasn't just a one-off fraudster. He was a predator who had spent years honing his craft, making promises, offering deals, and leaving people empty-handed. As the stories mounted, it became impossible to ignore how many lives Benny had impacted. I wrote about how he had promised me everything, an amazing job, discounted electronics, and then vanished, leaving behind only broken promises and stolen time. The post ended with a simple line: "Has this happened to you?" He wanted to stop the blog from spreading, but all he managed to do was draw more attention to it. Some people connected through the blog and worked together to seek legal action against Benny. Others simply found comfort in knowing they weren't alone. The blog had become a community, a place where people could vent their frustration, share their grief, and find solidarity in their shared experience. The blog remained the first result on Google when you searched his name. I had never intended for it to become this big. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the truth, about making sure that no one else would fall into the same trap we had. But as the blog gained momentum, it became clear that it was doing far more than just sharing stories. It was creating a permanent record of Benny's actions, one that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. I wasn't sure if anyone would care, but I knew I had to try. I had to put the truth out there. While we had been fortunate enough to get our money back, I couldn't help. The comments started pouring in almost immediately. People from all over shared their own stories of how Benny had scammed them. One person mentioned the same TV deal Benny had promised them. Another spoke about the job offer that never materialized. As I read the comments, I realized how much worse this was than I'd originally thought. Benny hadn't just targeted us. He had been preying on people for years, taking advantage of their hopes, their desperation, their trust. His scams were far more widespread than I could have imagined. But think of the others who might still be in the dark, falling into the same trap. These people had trusted me with their pain, and I knew I had to do something more. I reached out to several of them, asking if they would be willing to share their stories more publicly on the blog. I wanted to turn the comment section into a real archive of Benny's deceit. With their permission, I started turning their comments into full posts, preserving their experiences for others to see. Benny hadn't just scammed us, he had scammed so many others. And the thought of him continuing to deceive people made my blood boil. I felt like I had to do something, not just for me, but for anyone who might be vulnerable to his charms in the future. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. I couldn't just sit back and let these stories fade away in the comments section. As the blog grew, so did its reach. The more posts I added, the more victims came forward. But Benny didn't take kindly to this growing online presence. When Benny's lawsuit went nowhere, he took the matter to appeals, and then to the Supreme Court. Over time, the comment section became a space for victims to not only share their stories, but to support one another. What started as a simple post about my own experience had turned into a powerful tool for accountability. Even as the years passed, and Benny faded into the background of our lives, the blog remained. Despite Benny's best efforts to silence the blog through legal action, it quickly became clear that he could not escape the consequences of his actions. His initial case against me, accusing me of undermining his activity, was swiftly dismissed. But Benny, unwilling to let go of his pride and desperate to make the blog disappear, took the matter to appeals. When that also failed, he escalated things all the way to the Supreme Court. In the end, not only did Benny lose the case, but he was also ordered to pay for the attorney's fees of the party he had sued me. It was something that Benny couldn't hide from, no matter how many legal battles he fought. And no matter how hard he tried to bury the truth, the internet has a way of keeping records. His past will always be out there for anyone who cares to look. Leave a comment and let others know they're not alone. Together, we can prevent this from happening again. And for me, that's the kind of justice that truly matters. The kind that doesn't require a court to pass judgment, but simply the truth to be seen and shared. Benny's actions can't be undone, but his legacy will forever remind others of the consequences of trusting someone like him. His name had become synonymous with scams, deceit, and manipulation. On the other hand, I'll never get back the time, hope, or trust that he took from us. But through it all, I've learned one thing. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's making sure others don't fall victim to the same traps. The blog is still up, and as long as it helps even one person avoid Benny's deceit, I consider it a small victory. The blog, which started as a simple attempt to share my own story, had turned into a permanent record of his actions. Even to this day, years after the legal battles were over, his name is forever linked to his lies. The stories of his victims live on in the blog's comments, creating a lasting memory of the damage he caused. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. What struck me most, though, wasn't the outcome of the case. It was how Benny's life seemed to crumble around him. His actions had finally caught up with him in ways that no court decision could ever fully address. His father, who had been forced to bail him out financially, distanced himself further. His brother, a doctor who had once been a point of reference in the community, had no choice but to sever ties with him as well. Benny had burned so many bridges, and there were no easy fixes left. His life, once filled with the illusion of control and success, was unraveling piece by piece. Even his former lawyer, who had represented him in the lawsuit, ended up suing him for unpaid legal fees. It was a fitting irony Benny had manipulated people for so long, but in the end, even those who had worked for him were victims of his deceit. As for Benny, it seemed like everything he had built, every relationship he had relied on, was falling apart. But perhaps the most significant consequence of all wasn't legal or financial, it was personal. No amount of money could repair the damage Benny had done to the people he scammed. Sure, we had been paid back, but the emotional toll, the time lost, and the hopes dashed couldn't be undone by a check. The frustration, the anger, the feeling of being taken advantage of, those things stayed with us, and with every other person Benny had victimized. The blog, though, was a different kind of consequence. Benny may have paid back the money he owed, but he could never erase the stain on his reputation. Looking back, I feel conflicted. On one hand, I'm relieved that Benny faced some consequences for his actions. If you've been scammed or deceived in a similar way, share your story.